Well, I got a new haircut, and you know what that means. It's time for a brand new video. It's also time for some hard truths, people. We all need a come to Jesus moment sometimes, and this is yours and mine as well. All of us who are Dresden Files fans have a certain way that we see the books play out in our mind. We have our ideas of what the characters look like and the big set piece battles, as well as the small quiet moments that get us right in the feels, right? We all want a new Dresden Files show, and we all want to see our favorite scenes or maybe our favorite entire books play out on screen in a way that is true to the source material. However, if we're being really honest with ourselves, we'll recognize that Hollywood is not doing a great job of adapting source material faithfully. I was shocked at how badly they adapted The Wheel of Time. That show was an absolute travesty to its source material in almost every single way. There's also less extreme examples like some of the Harry Potter movies, as much as I love them, and even the Silo show on Apple TV does not adapt the book faithfully, although I did think the show was better by a lot. When it comes to Dresden Files, I think we need to recognize that we're not going to get everything we want. Hopefully it'll be more faithful than the early 2000s show, but I think we need to look at the series and try to figure out what they could change with it while still being true to the books. I know that that's a really harsh reality, but it is what it is. It's really fun to speculate on what we would love to see, but there is a reality to the situation. So let's sit down together and look at this series and try to decide what we can live without and what we think the show could actually do really well. Also, I reached out to the community on Reddit and asked for their thoughts on a lot of my points. I'll shout out some of the best comments during the video and use them as talking points. Also, if you'd like to see the whole post, it'll be linked down in the description. And before we go ahead, I will warn you that there will probably be some spoilers for the Dresden Files series in general, so just be aware of that going into this video. The first thing I think the show could do really well is the relationship between Harry and Karen Murphy. This relationship seems like it was made for TV, starting out kind of adversarial light, then to friendship, then they could do the whole will they won't they for a few seasons, and then finally them getting together later on. However, I think the show would probably start their actual romance a bit sooner in the show, since in the books, we really only get one book of them together before the big scene that made us throw the book across the room and cry into our pillows for 2 hours. No? Just me? This relationship could be one of the major emotional ties and drama points for people just tuning into the show without having read the books. I think that if the whole dynamic is established really well early on and they'd have to nail it, it would be a source of many people coming back week after week. And also, who doesn't want to see the massive height difference between them on screen, right? One of the concerns that show producers have noted about doing adaptations, and especially fantasy adaptations, is that a lot of the motivation planning and decision making happens inside a character's head, which we as the reader see as an inner monologue when we read a first person story or a third person omniscient. There is a ton of inner monologue in the Dresden Files, and I think this could be done exactly how it was in the 2007 show, or an even better example is Dexter. I am a massive fan of Dexter, and my favorite moments in that show are at the beginning and the end of each episode, and even throughout the episodes sometimes when he talks directly to the audience via an audible inner monologue, almost kind of narrating himself. This worked so incredibly well, and I think that a Dresden TV show would thrive on this formula. Honestly, I think a lot of what Dexter did could directly correlate to making a Dresden show. The pacing is very similar, and they found a way to tell one entire story arc each season while also having a bunch of side stories throughout. Also, this may sound odd at first, but hear me out. I think something the show needs to absolutely nail is Harry's basement apartment. Harry's basement is a foundational part of the series that grounds Harry and the reader in a place that they can return to and be safe and to plan the next stage of the investigation or whatever's happening next. It's welcoming despite its dingy interior, and it's a place where we can pause the action for a minute to catch our breath. Again, I think Dexter did this incredibly well with his apartment. You always knew that when he was in his apartment, everything was okay until it wasn't, like we see in the Dresden Files as well. And with it being a staple, it hurts all the more when it's taken away. Also, just a quick note, I think for Harry's actor, they need to find someone that fits the bill physically. Obviously, they won't be able to find an actor that looks like Harry and acts like him while also being 6'7", but they should try to get close and then use clever camera work to get the rest of the way there. After all, Elijah Wood wasn't really 3 feet tall in the Lord of the Rings movies. I think what they need most of all is to nail the proportions of the character. Harry isn't a normal looking guy, and as much as I love Paul Blackthorne, he was not physically a good fit for Harry, although I do think that he pulled off certain aspects of Harry's personality quite well. And speaking of personality, they need to find someone with whatever magic Harrison Ford has. Every time I think of Harry's snark and wit, I think of a slightly goofier Han Solo. This next point is where we're going to spend most of our time, and it's where the Reddit comments start coming in. We know that Dresden Files is going to be about 26 books when it's all said and done. And we also know that there's no way we're going to get that many seasons. We'll be incredibly lucky if we get a full 8-season run. So what books can we completely cut out of the TV show, and what other books can we combine into one season? I know that hurts to hear. I know that we all have our favorite book that isn't necessarily, a major plot point in the story, and it's not necessarily everybody else's favorite. But the truth is, a lot of books are going to have to get cut, and a lot of other books are going to have to be combined, and so they may not tell the story exactly how it appears in the book. But for example, I think that Proven Guilty and White Knight could easily be combined into one season. Since we do see Madrigal in Proven Guilty and White Knight, and Molly becoming Harry's apprentice could happen earlier in the season, with the rest of the season being her very early apprenticeship under Harry, and then the conclusion of White Knight. However, those are also both books that could be cut out, especially White Knight. We do need to see Molly become his apprentice and that whole story arc in Proven Guilty, but the bulk of those books could largely be cut away with little effect on the series as a whole. So I think that what would most likely happen is that the key points from Proven Guilty and maybe 1 or 2 key points from White Knight might be pushed into another book's season. Ghost Gabe 81 on Reddit says, I don't think each book needs to be stretched into a whole season. They could easily do 2, maybe even 3 books per season. For example, depending on the length or number of episodes, season 1 could cover Stormfront, Full Moon, and Grave Peril. And I think this is a great point. I think they get rid of Full Moon since it's more of a side story to the main series plot, and they just kind of combine Stormfront and Grave Peril. I think there's good things in both of those books, but I would not be surprised if they just mashed it all together. And then there's your first season. However, I will make the distinction that I don't think the showrunners would do each story back to back in a season. For example, running through the entire story of Stormfront, ending and everything, and then going directly into Grave Peril for the second half of the season. I think they probably take aspects and specific plot beats from each book and meld them together to tell one story. Showrunners don't want to do the Supernatural thing anymore, where there's 20 seasons and multiple different story arcs throughout one season. They want to tell one cohesive, streamlined story in one season. I know it's easy when we're talking about what we would love from a Dresden Files show to mention shows like Buffy and Supernatural and a dozen other shows from the early 2000s, but the reality is that shows really aren't being made like that anymore, besides maybe a couple outliers. But for the most part, shows like Buffy are not being made today. Okay, this Reddit comment will be a long one, but I think that it's really worth reading, and I think it's probably the best comment out of all of them over on Reddit. I'll kind of chime in between each of his paragraphs. Snarky Bookworm 34 says, on reflection, the idea from the original show to have a somewhat episodic structure is not a bad idea to go with, at least at first. I think several of the early books can be stripped down and modified to be done adequately as single episode arcs or really short multi-episode arcs, with the goal of introducing the main and secondary cast we all know and love. In terms of main plot books, which need more time and development, probably those would be Proven Guilty, Turncoat, Changes, and Cold Days. So I agree that the episodic nature of the original show was not bad at all, honestly. However, I think that Hollywood has largely moved away from that kind of show besides sitcoms and the very occasional example, and this is kind of what I was talking about earlier. Remember, if we get a show, it will probably be very similar in structure to everything else that's out there right now. And keep this in mind because this will actually come up in a future comment here in a little bit. But I do agree that they will need to introduce the majority of the people we see in later books, and this will probably be done by moving some of the timeline around to introduce Thomas sooner, as well as the Fae Courts and some other key side characters. I already mentioned that I think they'd most likely do a blending of the books rather than have them back to back in each season, but I think this general idea is a good one. I also agree with most of the books he mentioned besides Turncoat. I think the major plot points of this book could probably be combined with the first half of Changes, or honestly, even just mentioned in a council meeting or something in that book's season. And I would also add Grave Peril, which could be the first season, as well as probably Stormfront. They would probably be combined. Death Masks, which could be combined with certain scenes from Blood Rights, could be the second season. And then Deadbeat and maybe Proven Guilty could be combined into one for the third season if we don't get White Knight in there. I think there's something that they could probably do with Deadbeat and Proven Guilty. After all, Molly originally was planned to fill the role that Butters was in that book. Molly was supposed to be on the dinosaur with Harry, so I think maybe they could even retroactively redo that, and instead of having Butters there, as much as we'd all love to see that, maybe they have Molly do it, and that's kind of how she becomes his apprentice. But Snarky Bookworm goes on to say, Grave Peril's main plot is not actually all that important to the overall story, except that it is the beginning of the Vampire War storyline. So I imagine a clever showrunner could basically snip the sections about Bianca's ball and put it in another background story if they need to. It would be a climactic point to either have as a mid-season finale or a first season finale. Yes, that would be awesome. As a result, although this fudges the timeline a little bit, I would actually suggest a lot of the main plots for the first six-ish books be pushed to occur before Bianca's ball in Grave Peril as one-off episodes to flesh out Harry's supporting cast. For example, the stuff with the Shroud from Death Masks could be moved forward as a way to introduce the audience to the Knights of the Cross and Nicodemus as a recurring antagonist. Full Moon definitely can be structured as a one or two off episode easily if we cut out some of the red herring werewolf groups and the other antagonists and focus on the alphas, the Hexenwolves, and McFinn. Ooh, man, that one took me so many takes to read, but I'm so close to agreeing with all of this, except that I think that Grave Peril is a rather important point of the overall story. It's where everything really starts taking off and is directly linked to Changes. And also, it sets up Karen's fear of her mind being messed with by supernatural entities, which plays a recurring role all throughout the series, and shows that she does fear things and isn't just a badass girl boss. And I think we've seen enough of those lately. I would really hope that they don't do that with Karen's character, but who knows? But I do like this overall idea of moving certain story beats around to introduce us to certain characters early on. However, I kind of think Death Masks combined with maybe Blood Rights really should be its own season, as so much important stuff happens that is pivotal to the rest of the series. However, I still kind of think Death Masks combined with maybe Blood Rites really should be its own season, as so much important stuff happens that is pivotal to the rest of the series, especially if the third season was Deadbeat. Mr. Bookworm goes on to say, as for the magic needing to be toned down, that's fair if we're doing live action. Ironically, the more noir detective-y stuff at the beginning is more likely to work well with a lower SFX budget, I think he means VFX, than the more high-octane action stuff that comes later in the series, even though it's the later stuff that's more beloved by fans. And with this, I totally agree. This may sound crazy, but I really don't think that the CGI and practical effects budget would be that costly, at least not for the first couple seasons, and at least not more than any other shows on HBO or something, and that's, who we'd be hoping would pick it up, either them or Apple Plus. Early on, a lot of it is fire or unseen force. We don't really get the big flashy magic until much later on, and hopefully their budget would grow by then. However, I think where the budget would really start redlining is when we get into like the makeup and the costuming for the more interesting looking creatures and bad guys. I'm not saying there wouldn't be a lot of CGI, but I honestly don't think it would be much more than any other fantasy show currently. His last note here, he says, also, go all out for Deadbeat. I don't care if the main plot to that book hasn't been essential to the overall series. I don't care what the budgetary shortcuts they need for some of the other magical elements in the series up to that point, but the world needs zombie dinosaur. First of all, they would be certifiably insane to not include Deadbeat in the list of books that makes it onto the big screen. Honestly, if they only did one Dresden Files movie ever, I think that Deadbeat would be a perfect candidate. And yes, we all need to see Sue on screen, and a large portion of their budget should simply just go to that and the massive battle and Dark Hollow at the end of that book. Continuing on, Yaku Saka simply says, 1. Animation, which is something that a lot of the fandom really wants. 2. 2 to 5 hour-long episodes per book, 13 to 16 episodes per season. 3. Work with Jim Butcher. 4. Get James Marsters to voice Harry. And 5. Profit. Seems like a pretty simple plan, right? So I'll address these in order. I know that the fan base has been crying out for an animated series, but I just don't think that will happen. It's certainly possible, and it's been discussed many times, even in interviews with Jim Butcher. But besides a couple key animated shows that sort of took off, like Arcane and Castlevania, the medium is still pretty niche and doesn't appeal to a wider audience outside of the hardcore fans. Production companies want something that will be more like a Game of Thrones on HBO. That's probably what they'll be aiming for. The second point I definitely disagree with. It's fun to speculate and wish for things that we would love to see, but if the point of this is to be realistic, we're not going to get multiple books back to back in one season. It would, like I said, it would be more of like a mixture of 2 or more books per season to tell one big story arc. And there is absolutely no way in hell we're getting 13 to 16 episodes a season. Wheel of Time, a massively popular series on the same fandom scale as Lord of the Rings, only got 8 episodes, and that really seems to be par for the course. Believe me, I desperately miss the days of 16 episode seasons, but it's not the early 2000s anymore. We're more than likely getting 8 episodes per season, maybe 10 if we're extremely lucky, or if production has changed a lot by then. But I also saw several people saying that they needed to make them 1.5 to 2 hour episodes. And I think that this is way overestimating what these production companies are willing to do. I'll tell you right now, there is no way in hell that we get anything above a 1 hour episode. Believe me, I'd love 2 hour episodes of the Dresden Files, but it's absolutely not reasonable to think that we would. If Wheel of Time didn't get it, then we definitely won't get it for the Dresden Files. And as for the rest of it, I totally agree. Work with Jim Butcher. I think that every adaptation needs to have the author in the room on set so that they can ask questions and whatnot. It's just wild to me that that isn't standard practice for these shows. And if it's animated, yeah, get James Marsters. He's obviously amazing. So then Bethers writes, no show, live action or animated, is going to have 20 plus seasons unless maybe it is an absolute runaway success. So how could there be a show that would be anything but a tease when inevitably it gets canceled after a season or 3? And here's what I think. 1. Set it around Deadbeat to White Knight so most of our main characters are there. Make it mostly original stories, but unlike the 2007 attempt, keep those stories inside the universe canon. Maybe start with some of the short stories. 3. Plant some main storyline seeds so that if it is successful, the main plot can be weaved in either with stories before or after the time it is set. 4. Use some flashbacks if necessary, both to canon before the story is set and pre-canon. If you do that, you can tackle one important subplot at a time and make it more digestible. You can still have some of the big set pieces, it just doesn't need to be in strict timeline order. 6. Focus on Harry and the main supporting characters, maybe more than the books, meaning Harry, Murph, Thomas, Molly, and Mouse, then Michael, Butters, Billy, and Bob. So I'm going to be honest, I don't think that they would do this, and I don't think that it's what the majority of the fan base would necessarily want, but I don't hate the idea. To be honest, I personally didn't hate the original show despite its many flaws. I feel like there was a concept there and I could see what they were going for, they just didn't execute it properly. But I think that given the episodic nature of the books, this could potentially work if they were able to just stick to the short stories and not focus on the major plot points of the series. The downside is, I don't think that they can go very far with that, and I think that it would confuse the new readers as to the overall point of the show, and it would probably piss off a lot of the fan base because they'd have to do some clever ways of like weaving it into the main plot. But I think that there's at least an idea here that's worth thinking about. Lastly, let's end on a somewhat happy note with a post from Miss Brightside 91 as she gives some hope from an example of another adaptation that's been done really well recently. She says, whether it's going to be animated or live action, please give it the same treatment that One Piece live action got. The creator was heavily involved, the showrunners and writers were huge fans, they casted mostly relative unknowns and huge budget. I get that One Piece is one of the biggest IPs internationally, but if they follow that same formula where there's a ton of heart, but some concessions were made to condense and retell the story, because One Piece has over 1,100 chapters and it's still going. That's crazy. I knew One Piece was long, but I didn't know it was that long. But when it comes to condensing the story, One Piece is a great example. They must have some sort of plan of how they're going to do that, which gives me hope that it can be done with something as big as the Dresden Files. And she's right. I haven't read or watched One Piece, but from what I can tell, they poured their heart and soul into the show, and also were able to condense and retell the story without losing what makes the manga and anime so great for so many fans. By all accounts, it's gotten really amazing reception. I absolutely think that it should be given the same treatment, and it's so great to hear that the original creator was so involved. The saddest thing about the 2007 show was hearing from Jim on interviews that they barely talked to him at all during the production, and it really shows. That show literally could have been labeled anything other than Dresden Files with the way that it was handled, and at the end of the day, I enjoyed most of it, but it wasn't a true Dresden Files show, and having Jim on board would have done wonders for it. It could have been something really cool if he had been more involved. Luckily, Jim has stated that if he were to do it again, he would make sure that he's involved to a much more significant degree. And I think that this is a trend that we're going to see with a lot of authors when they're getting their stuff adapted, like with Brandon Sanderson. He's not budging on a whole lot, and so production companies are turning down adaptations of like Mistborn and stuff, but he won't budge on it. And I think that that's more important than just getting HBO to make your book into a show. I think it's important to be faithful to your own source material and for the production company to be working with you as an author. Overall, I'm both eager and a little scared to see a Dresden Files adaptation. It's my favorite series of all time, and I wouldn't want to see it butchered like so many others. However, in preparing for this video, it gave me a lot of insight on what the Wheel of Time showrunners must have been feeling and how they couldn't just do a scene-for-scene recreation. And again, I'll say that I wish the standards for fantasy adaptations were different. I wish we got 2-hour episodes and 16 episode long seasons and a ton of other stuff. I can wish for this stuff all day, but the purpose of this exercise was to work within the current standards for book adaptation production. So that's what I did, and I really hope you guys enjoyed it. Also, I will say that with the Wheel of Time TV show, a perfect recreation was never what I was asking for. I still think the way they changed things was not just messing with the timeline or condensing things, but actually changing major lore and story beats from the books, as well as a ton of weird character changes that just made no sense. At the end of the day, it just wasn't a good show, let alone a good adaptation, and I hope that when we do get a Dresden Files adaptation someday, we can at least sit down with our popcorn and have a great time despite whatever changes they may make. I want to thank everyone who wrote in on Reddit. You guys came out in full force, and I genuinely had such a great time reading all of your responses and carefully considering each one. I'm sorry if I didn't get to your response, but just know that I read them all and really appreciate your input. Feel free to comment down below on this video if you'd like to talk more about various aspects of making a Dresden Files TV show. There's so much I didn't even get to, like what the later books would look like in a show format. That's a whole episode in itself, and I'd love to do that in the future if this video is received well. If you enjoyed this video, consider hitting the like and subscribe buttons. It really does help us get seen by more Dresden Files fans just like yourself. Speaking of which, if you're new here, we've done a bunch of Dresden Files episodes, and we have an entire playlist for them on our channel page, so check that out if you're a Dresden fan like us. Lastly, you can reach out to us on Twitter, Discord, and Patreon, where you can get exclusive Fantasy Files content for just $3 a month, all of which is linked down below in the description. Thank you all so much for watching, and let's just hope that when showrunners do try and make a faithful Dresden Files adaptation, that Waldo Butters will be there telling them, "Mister, where I come from, there is no try."